picture your street, your neighborhood. You can probably count at least one church building nearby, maybe several.
Oh, definitely.
It can feel like the religious landscape is pretty set in stone, you know?
Yeah, it seems that way on the surface.
But what if the number of buildings doesn't tell the whole story? What if even in these places that seem saturated, a really rapid expansion of new faith communities is possible, or like even already happening?
Exactly. And it's happening more at a grassroots level.
Right, not about mega churches getting bigger. This is something, well, different, more nimble, more organic.
That's precisely it. And that's the core of what we're digging into today. We're doing a deep dive into church planting movements, CPMs, right here in places like the US and Europe. You know, the so-called churched or post-churched cultures.
Okay.
But here's where it gets really interesting. The core ideas, the principles driving these movements, they didn't actually start here.
Oh, where did they come from?
They really grew out of places like Asia and Africa, where the whole faith landscape looked totally different. Necessity, it really sparked this revolutionary approach.
Yeah.
Exponential growth. And now we're seeing how that might apply in our own backyards.
Right. So if you've ever wondered, like I have, if there's a more dynamic, maybe a more ground level way for faith to really take hold and spread, even in places that are just steeped in religious tradition,
Yeah.
then this deep dive is definitely for you. Because sometimes, let's be honest, the established ways of doing church can feel like they're, I don't know, missing a spark, a certain momentum.
For sure. I think a lot of people feel that.
So today, we're going to unpack a perspective that might just reignite something.
And just to set the stage a bit, it's important you understand where we're getting this from. We're looking closely at a document that specifically asks, how can these CPM principles, which were so effective elsewhere, be adapted for places that already have a lot of churches? And the document itself flags an initial hurdle, skepticism. You know, that feeling of, well, that worked there, but it won't work here.
Right, the context argument.
Exactly. So the idea is, for these principles to really catch on more widely, we need to see them working. We need real-world examples in these cultures.
Okay, so our mission then for this deep dive is to really get under the hood of these core CPM ideas. And crucially, understand the practical tweaks, the adaptations needed for them to actually flourish here.
Yeah, offer a fresh perspective. Maybe challenge some assumptions about how faith spreads.
Sounds good. So let's start at the beginning. Where did these church planting movements, where did they actually come from? What's the origin story?
Well, the genesis is pretty fascinating, actually. They largely grew out of regions with just massive populations, huge numbers of people.
Okay.
And at the same time, really limited access for traditional church planting. Think, you know, vast areas with not nearly enough missionaries or money to put up church buildings everywhere.
So a resource challenge, basically.
A huge one. But that reality, that mismatch, tons of people, few traditional resources, it didn't stop things. It actually became the catalyst.
Necessity being the mother of invention.
Exactly. It forced the development of this revolutionary, rapidly self-replicating model of church. New believers had to figure out how to quickly reproduce small, self-sustaining communities without relying on outside leaders coming in or external funding.
It sounds almost like a biological thing, like a chain reaction, self-replicating.
That's a great way to put it. And the source material actually uses the word serendipity, which I found interesting.
Serendipity, how so?
It talks about the rediscovery of principles and practices that were, well, fundamental to the early discipleship movement, way back.
So these aren't brand new ideas then, more like things we forgot.
Pretty much. Or aspects that maybe got sidelined or just weren't emphasized as much in some traditions over the years.
Okay.
And the source really stresses that for CPMs to get going anywhere, really, believers often need to step outside their usual ways of thinking and doing things.
Break the mold a bit.
Yeah. There can be these deeply ingrained habits or expectations that maybe unintentionally just stifle this kind of rapid growth. People might even be skeptical or mock initial attempts. But the document highlights how crucial it is to just persevere in faith through that.
Now, something that really jumped out at me and seemed kind of backwards was the idea that a lack of intense persecution in places like the US or Europe might actually be an obstacle for CPMs. How does that work?
I know, it sounds totally counterintuitive, right?
Yeah.
But the source kind of flips that. It suggests that the moment a CPM does start gaining real traction, that's when opposition can actually emerge, because it's inherently disruptive. It challenges the status quo.
Ah, okay, so the movement itself can generate friction.
Exactly. The source even mentions a church planting network in the U.S. that, even before they fully went down the CPM road, got labeled as cult-like.
Wow. Just for being intense about discipleship.
Apparently,
Yeah.
just for their focus on radical discipleship and evangelism, it shows how any deviation can attract criticism.
And it's interesting, the source also has this little story, an anecdote,
Yeah.
about people who were involved in house churches in a Western setting, and they initially felt like something was missing, like it didn't feel like real church to them.
That's a really common reaction, isn't it? It comes from years, maybe decades, of experiencing church in a more traditional building-centric way.
Yeah.
But the story goes on to say, when these same people actually saw similar models working overseas, saw the vibrancy, the community, their whole perspective shifted.
They got it.
They got it. They realized what they thought was missing was actually just different, a valid, powerful expression of church. And they wouldn't go back.
Okay, so we have these core principles born out of necessity, rediscovered from the early church. Now, the big question, how do you adapt that blueprint for, say, the US or Europe, places with tons of existing churches and different cultural vibes?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And the Force lays out several key adaptations that seem to be working in practice. The first one is about how we structure church gatherings. It acknowledges that, in many Western cultures, there's this expectation of larger worship celebrations,
Yeah.
often built around strong preaching.
Sure, the Sunday morning service model.
Right. So the advice isn't necessarily ditch that entirely. If it exists, fine. But the key is to strategically multiply the smaller gatherings alongside it.
Okay, so you might still have your big service, weekly or monthly or whatever.
You could.
But the real engine, the growth engine, becomes these smaller, more intimate groups, maybe like home groups, but turbocharged.
Exactly. Turbocharged is a good word. The source suggests empowering these smaller groups to function almost like house churches themselves, even if you don't call them that at first.
What does that mean functionally?
Well, letting them practice things like baptism, the Lord's Supper, maybe even receiving offerings, right there in their small group setting.
Wow, okay.
The crucial part is giving them real autonomy and support so they can eventually launch more new groups. They become the seeds of the movement. And there's a case study later that talks about deliberately avoiding the word church for these small groups initially.
Interesting. Yeah, that makes sense. Meet people where they are, avoid some baggage maybe. Okay, the next adaptation mentioned is launch. Don't just multiply. That sounds subtle. What's the difference?
It is subtle, but it's a big shift in thinking. The traditional small group model is often, invite new people into your existing group, hope it grows, and then eventually split it. Multiply later.
Right. Addition first, then multiplication maybe?
Yeah. The CPM approach flips that. It encourages believers to immediately launch brand new groups with the people they lead to faith, right within their existing networks, their friends, family, colleagues, their oikos.
So multiplication from day one, essentially.
Yeah.
Outward focus.
Exactly. Rapid outward expansion right from the start.
Okay, and that connects to the next point, doesn't it? Shortening or even skipping long leadership training phases before someone launches a group. That feels a bit risky, unorthodox.
It can feel that way compared to traditional models, but the logic is this. The training for trainers process, T4T, is the leadership development.
Ah, learn by doing.
Pretty much. Someone leads a friend to faith. They immediately start a group with that friend using the simple T4T format. And crucially, they're still in their own T4T group, getting coached and growing themselves.
So it's like on-the-job training happening in parallel.
Exactly. Rather than a long apprenticeship before you're allowed to lead anything.
Yeah.
That traditional model, the source suggests, can just be too slow to fuel rapid multiplication.
Okay, less hierarchy, more peer-to-peer learning and action.
Yeah.
Makes sense. The next key point, focus on the lost. Not just shuffling Christians between churches or trying to reactivate people who've dropped out.
Yes, this is absolutely fundamental. The source is really clear. Globally, successful CPMs are always marked by their focus on reaching genuinely unreached people.
People with no connection at all.
Right. People who aren't just switching churches or coming back after a break. While those things might happen, the main energy, the primary thrust, has to be towards people completely outside the current church world.
And you can't wait for them to come to you, right? Which leads to the idea of go to where the losses are.
Precisely. You can't just expect people with no church background to wander into a Sunday service. It requires a deliberate shift, actively going out, seeking people who are open.
The persons of peace idea.
Yeah, finding those people whose hearts seem prepared. It means cultivating boldness and sharing faith and being willing to engage people in their everyday spaces.
Like where?
Well, the source gives some really diverse examples of who's being reached. People dealing with addiction, the homeless, even atheists, professionals.
Huh.
Often at weird times, in places like coffee shops, parks, workplaces, not just on Sunday morning.
The idea of redefining lostness also struck me as important, moving beyond just a simple in or out.
Yeah, that's a really practical adaptation.
Yes.
The case study we'll get to later nails this. They shifted from asking, do you know 10 lost people, to do you know 10 people far from God?
Ah, that feels different. Less judgmental, maybe.
It does, and people found it easier to answer. They might struggle to label friends as lost, but they could easily think of people who, maybe grew up with some faith background but now have zero connection. It just broadened the scope.
Okay.
And the next step they taught was, okay, among those people far from God, is there someone whose life seems to be in flux?
Yeah.
Someone open, someone God might be stirring.
So it becomes more relational, more specific, looking for signs of openness.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Much more practical. And that flows right into the next principle.
Yeah.
Off-site evangelism, training, and church.
Meaning not necessarily in the church building.
Right. If you want to connect with people where they live, work, and play, then how you engage them needs to match that. The example of T4T training happening in diners or coffee shops is key.
Why is the training location so important?
Because it makes it relatable. If you're trained in a coffee shop, it's much easier to imagine yourself doing the same thing, sharing your faith, starting a study with your friends in a similar, normal setting.
Ah, the medium is the message, kind of.
Sort of, yeah. The training location models the destination, and, as the source points out, it means being available when unchurched people are available. Evenings, weekends, not just office hours.
This leads into the idea of longer evangelism tracks, right? For people maybe not ready for a direct gospel pitch straight away.
Exactly. Not everyone responds to that immediate confrontation. So the idea of discovery groups or discovery studies comes in.
What do those look like?
They might be groups that meet for, say, 6 to 10 weeks. They use inductive Bible study, asking questions, letting people discover truths for themselves from the text rather than being lectured.
Less threatening, maybe?
Potentially, yeah. And they often use that 3/3 meeting process, looking back at the past week, looking up at God through the scripture, and looking forward to application and sharing. That builds community and accountability.
And these can just morph into ongoing groups or house churches.
That's the idea. As people come to faith within that group, it naturally transitions to being their church community.
Now, in places like the US or UK, new things can sometimes be viewed with suspicion by established churches. How do you handle that? The umbrella of covering idea seems relevant here.
It's a very strategic point. Having a broader church structure, or maybe an established network, provides some kind of covering or affiliation for these new small groups can be really helpful.
Why? What does it do?
It gives them legitimacy. It can head off criticism or misunderstanding from more traditional folks.
Yeah.
You might have dozens of house churches multiplying, but perhaps you initially frame them as, say, discipleship groups under the umbrella of XYZ network.
Okay, so it provides an identity.
Yeah, and confidence for the new believers, too. They feel part of something bigger, even if their primary expression is small and less formal.
And related to managing perceptions, there's the advice for strategic silence initially. Don't shout it from the rooftops right away.
Right, especially in environments where there might be ridicule or maybe even well-meaning people trying to jump in and help in ways that could derail things.
Protect the seedling while it takes root.
Exactly. Let it get established, gain some strength before making a big public splash.
I liked the sound of the Daniel Project. That seems like a really practical way to start within an existing church.
It does. It's like a pilot program almost. Low risk, potentially high reward. You take a small group of people in your church, maybe newer believers, people not already overloaded with church jobs.
Right, people with some bandwidth.
Yeah, and you start a pure T4T process with them off to the side without disrupting all the existing church programs. See what happens, see if it bears fruit. It's a way to test the waters.
But doing this kind of thing takes time. Church leaders are often already maxed out. The point about divesting from low-value activities seems crucial.
Oh, absolutely essential. If you're serious about seeing a CPM emerge, leaders have to get ruthless about their calendars.
Yeah.
What really contributes to this goal?
Which is what according to the source.
Vision casting, constantly keeping the why in front of people. Personally witnessing, actually sharing faith with lost people. And training others, equipping the saints for the work of ministry. Specifically this kind of ministry.
And it's not a small commitment.
No. The source pushes back on the idea that you can launch a CPM with just a few hours a week. Especially at the beginning. It takes significant focused time and energy. Less admin, more multiplying activities.
Which leads naturally to train everyone, not just the potential leaders, but everybody. How do you even do that?
Well, the suggestion is to repurpose existing church gatherings, your main worship service, Bible studies, small groups, intentionally weave training components into them.
So turn everything into a training opportunity.
In a sense, yeah. Equip all believers for evangelism and discipleship as part of the church's normal rhythm. Maybe do focused teaching series or weekend retreats, or read a book like this document together as a church. Make equipping central.
And for churches that already have small groups or home groups, adapting them to the 3/3 process seems like a concrete step.
It is. It might not even be a radical overhaul. It could just be about intentionally making sure all 7 components of that process are happening. Sometimes groups do the Bible study part, but neglect the looking back, accountability, or looking forward, setting goals to obey and share.
So retraining the existing leaders to facilitate the full process.
Exactly. It can be a gradual evolution, making those groups more effective launchpads.
And this idea of turning church facilities into training centers, that really reframes the building's purpose.
It does. It shifts the focus from the building being primarily the place where church happens to it being a resource hub for launching movements.
So the congregation isn't just the flock to be cared for.
They're the potential army to be equipped and sent out. Viewing every member as a potential future leader, a potential pastor of a new group or church. That's a significant mental shift for many leaders.
The willingness to go bivocational is a tough one, potentially. But your story earlier about your own experience made it very real.
Yeah, reflecting on that, you see how the pull towards a traditional, fully funded pastoral role and the building that often comes with it can sometimes inadvertently slow down or even halt the momentum of a potential movement.
So choosing bivocationalism isn't just about finances.
It can be a strategic choice, especially early on. Prioritizing the multiplication of gatherings over securing full-time support for one pastor in one location. It keeps the focus on expansion.
And then there's the bold option, start from scratch. Just bypass existing structures altogether.
Yeah, sometimes that's the cleanest way, particularly for reaching people who are completely disconnected or maybe even disillusioned with established religion.
How does that typically begin?
Often just by intentionally going into the community, building real relationships, sharing faith naturally, and then gathering those who respond into simple discovery groups or T4T groups.
Does it work better in less churchy areas?
The source suggests it might seem easier there initially, but it also gives examples of movements starting this way right in the middle of heavily churched regions. So it's possible anywhere.
Okay, lastly, the importance of casting a vision for the why. Why is that so critical?
Because people involved in this will inevitably interact with other Christians who have very different ideas about what church should look like, how discipleship works, etc.
Right, they'll face questions, maybe pushback.
Exactly. So you need to equip your people with a clear, positive, compelling reason for why you're taking this approach. Not defensively, but confidently. The source gives a good example of a vision statement that honors other expressions of church while clearly stating the rationale for the CPM focus. Helps people navigate those conversations.
Okay, wow, that's a lot of adaptations. So let's see it in action. The source gives a real-world example, right? From North Carolina, of all places.
Yes, and this case study is really encouraging because North Carolina is definitely considered a churched area, part of the Bible Belt. It shows this isn't just theory, it can happen here.
So what happened there?
Well, starting from absolute zero, a T4T movement emerged and grew to over 30 small groups in just 1 year.
30 groups in a year. From nothing.
Yeah, and the person who initiated it had experience applying these principles in South Asia and brought that back.
Okay, so what were the key adjustments they made for the U.S. context? The source highlights 3.
Right. The first was about language. They deliberately avoided potentially loaded terms like house church or organic church.
Why? What did they use instead?
They found those terms just sparked debate or brought up stereotypes, so they used a more neutral phrase, discipleship cycle, to describe the T4T process. Kept the focus on the practice, not the label.
Smart. Avoid unnecessary arguments. What was the second adjustment?
That redefinition of lostness we talked about,
Mm-hmm.
shifting to far from God,
Right.
and then coaching believers to identify people in their network who seemed far from God and whose lives seemed to be in a state of change or openness, looking for where God might already be working.
And the example of baptism.
Oh yeah, the horse trough. Baptizing new believers, family members, right where they lived in one case, a trailer park, using a horse trough. It's such a vivid picture of meeting people in their context.
Definitely. Okay, and the third adaptation.
It was a shift in the invitation, moving away from the default, come to my church service invitation.
Which is what most Christians are used to doing.
Exactly. Instead, they intentionally focused on inviting people to explore a relationship with Jesus directly, which often led to starting an evangelistic Bible study right in someone's home.
And the T4T groups provided the ongoing discipleship.
Yes. Those small, simple T4T groups became the place for growth and accountability, whether or not the person ever ended up attending a traditional church service. The focus was on making disciples who make disciples in small groups.
This whole approach seems to really hinge on empowering ordinary believers, doesn't it? And the source connects this to scribes in Matthew's gospel.
It does. It's a really powerful connection. Matthew 13.52. The scribe trained for the kingdom of heaven, bringing out treasures old and new.
How does that apply here?
Well, think about it. Churched cultures, like the U.S., are full of people with incredible Bible knowledge. Decades of Sunday school sermons, Bible studies. These are the scribes.
Okay, people who know the content.
Right. They have a deep reservoir of scriptural understanding. The argument is, when these individuals grasp the principles of the kingdom, when they understand how CPMs work and how to multiply disciples,
They can take off.
they can mature incredibly rapidly and become powerful catalysts. They already have the old treasures of knowledge. Now they're learning to bring out the new treasures of kingdom application and multiplication.
So the takeaway is that these supposedly saturated churched cultures might actually be the most fertile ground.
That's the provocative idea. Because of this untapped potential within biblically literate believers, these cultures could potentially be the ripest places for massive church planting movements to explode.
Yeah.
It flips the usual narrative.
That's a really hopeful and, unexpected thought.
It is, but the source doesn't end there. It lands with a really challenging question, a personal one. Basically, what's the cost? What are you, the listener? What are we willing to invest?
Yeah.
What might we need to sacrifice personally to see a church planting movement actually develop where we are?
Oof. Yeah. That brings it home. It's not just theory.
Not at all. It's a call to action, a call to count the cost.
Okay, let's try and distill this one last time. We've spent this deep dive looking at how these dynamic, maybe surprising principles of church planting movements. Principles first really seen taking off in less churched parts of the world
Right.
are actually adaptable. And they're already showing potential, already taking root in places like the US and Europe.
And the key takeaways for you, listening in, should hopefully be clearer now. It's about that intentional focus on reaching people who are genuinely outside the fold.
Yeah, the unreached.
It's about empowering new believers quickly, not waiting years, but equipping them to make disciples right away.
Adapting creatively.
Exactly. Using existing church structures, maybe even buildings, but adapting them to fuel multiplication and realizing the huge potential in people who already know their Bible well, those scribes.
So for our final provocative thought, something for you to chew on, think about those scribes in your own life, the people you know with deep biblical knowledge.
Yeah, who comes to mind?
How might they become catalysts for something new, a new movement of faith, as they start to grasp and apply these kingdom principles in fresh ways?
And maybe flip that question. What personal shifts, what changes in your own perspective or actions might be needed for you to see that kind of growth, that kind of multiplication happen in your own context?
It's definitely a lot to consider. We really hope this deep dive has maybe opened up some new possibilities for you, some exciting ones.